Hello and welcome to University Television Presents. I'm your host, Doug Mason. Today I have joining me Sam Fleischacker, who is a political philosophy professor at the University of Illinois Chicago, who is here in Boise for the Adam Smith Lecture Series to discuss empathy, perspective, and humanity. Welcome to Boise, Professor. How are you?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's great to be here.
I'm so glad that you're here. Have you been out in Boise before?
No, I've never been to Boise. I've only been once before to Idaho just for a night.
Really?
So it's a new thing for me.
Definitely. Well, we're glad you're out here. Definitely.
Thank you.
All right, well, we'll just dive right into it. So you're doing a lecture tonight for the Adam Smith Lecture Series. How did you get contacted by them?
Well, Professor Dalton wrote to me. I've written quite a bit about Adam Smith, and I guess he was looking for people who do work on scholars of Adam Smith, and I thought it was he was been very kind, and it sounded like an interesting project to share with people. I'm working still on Adam Smith, so worked out for both of us.
That is so great. That's so great, because the reason I ask is because the College of Business and Economics, which is the Kobe College here at Boise, actually runs the Adam Smith Lecture Series. So it was interesting to me when I was researching you, being a philosophy teacher, having a discussion through the Adam Smith Lecture Series. We're all very interested to what you have to say tonight. But speaking of that, I wanted to get a little bit of a preview or rundown of your speech tonight, Being Me, Being You. So could you give us a little insight?
So Being Me, Being You is the working title of a book I'm working on, which this lecture comes out of. I've been writing about Adam Smith since 1991 or something like that, many, many years. But it's mostly been scholarly work. What did Adam Smith have to say? How does he relate to other people of his time? How do we understand various features of his major books, etc.? But it began to occur to me recently, Adam Smith is really, among other things, one of the first thinkers of empathy, one of the first people to have a deep and systematic account of what empathy is, although he calls it sympathy, because the word empathy didn't exist. And I began to think that that's such an important concept for today's moral and political problems, that I should really not just write about Smith for scholars, but try to bring some of his ideas into today's moral problems. So this book is an attempt to think about empathy using Adam Smith and apply it to some of the issues that we face today.
That is really interesting. So when you speak about empathy, the other two concepts that you were referring to in your speech tonight is going to be perspective and humanity. So in terms of relation, how do those all three, do they all relate in some scenario?
Yes, but at least I think they relate, but the relationship's a bit complicated, and you'll have to come to the talk to get the detailed story. But here's the sort of very rough outline. Empathy can mean a lot of different things. For David Hume and for a lot of people today, empathy means just catching what other people feel. If you feel sad, I feel sad. If you feel happy, I feel happy. I just sort of pick it up for you. That's not what it is for Adam Smith. For Adam Smith, empathy is feeling what I think I would feel if I were in your situation. So that needn't be exactly what you feel. It could be something different. Right. I might think you're too happy, you're too sad, or whatever, right? Too angry, and I think I wouldn't be so angry, whatever. I'll go into a lot of those details this evening. Sure. But one of the other features for Smith, which is often not picked up, is that for Smith, I empathize with you if I not just try to think how I would feel in your situation, but try to think how would I feel from your perspective, if I occupied your perspective. And part of my argument is that by working out the notion of empathy, Smith also helps develop the notion of a perspective. And he's one of the first people to work that out. And that his notion of what it is to be human is to have a distinctive perspective. That what we're proud of, what we care about, is that we have a different way of looking at things from other people, and yet we can still talk, we can still share things.
Right.
So that very differentiated conception of human beings, that's something that I think Smith has to teach, and I think it's something rich and important. So that's the way these things work together.
It was very rich topic, and I think it has a lot of potential, especially in this, regarding the environment we all live in terms of the political spectrum, as well as the media landscape. But no, it sounds really interesting, really great. So you're a professor at the University of Illinois Chicago. Now, I'm a little curious because I was doing a little reading on what you teach, and do you have any like different views regarding moral status of culture or culture in general?
So I think you're picking that up partly because I wrote my dissertation about the nature of culture. And I have been interested in that for a long time. I've believed from early on, and I continue to believe, that our cultures are important to us and cultural difference is important to us, even if I also am a believer in the Enlightenment concept that we're all human and we share a lot and so forth, as Adam Smith teaches, among other people. Because I'm trying to hold these two things together, I certainly do not think that whatever your culture says is right, and that you should always listen to what your culture says, and that everything every culture believes is okay, and we should leave all cultures alone. Sometimes cultures are sexist, racist, homophobic, and in other ways restrictive or oppressive or painful for the people who live under them. Right. But that doesn't mean that they're unimportant, we should just throw them away. So I've been trying to work a kind of middle path between those things. But in my teaching, I think for most of my career, I've been really emphasizing the Enlightenment side, philosophers who stress what we have in common, and emphasizing less the cultural difference side. So I haven't taught that much about cultural difference lately. I've been teaching courses on justice and on property rights, on inequality, more general notions about what we have in common. Definitely what we share.
Is there like a reason that you may or may not shy away from cultural differences, or?
Well, I find it hard to teach. I think I always feel when I try to teach the importance of culture, the nature of culture, there's a lot of background one has to go into. And especially on the undergraduate level, I do not generally run into a lot of students who have really deep experience with a multitude of cultures. Usually grew up in the US, haven't been outside the US a whole lot. The relationships between culture and religion, between the notions of different cultural moralities clashing, it's something that's de-emphasized here. In part, that's a good thing. We tend to get along better than a lot of people in the rest of the world do. But it does mean that there's a huge amount of background you have to go into to sort of set up the problem. So on the one hand, I tend to have students who are pure cultural relativists, who basically say you can never interfere in another culture, and that's very problematic philosophically and morally. I
can see that. Yeah.
And then you have other people who don't see why you should care about cultural difference at all. They don't particularly care about it, and why can't we just get on and talk about justice and so forth. And trying to get them to the stage in which they can see what the difficulty is negotiating between these things is difficult. And I find it more fruitful in a philosophy program to be teaching some of the more standard philosophical issues, I guess.
So true. And as a professor, trying to bridge that gap between what's taught and what's taught elsewhere can be difficult, and I can see that being challenging. Okay, so I have to ask, since you're invited here through our business and econ program, I'm curious, the relation between economics and moral philosophy. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, it's a good question. The simplest answer is I'm here to talk about Adam Smith.
Sure.
Now, who was Adam Smith? Adam Smith is known as an economist, the founder of economics. The inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations is considered the founding text in economics. But officially, he was a moral philosophy professor. And that's not just a name, it is partly just a name, and moral philosophy covered everything that we put under the social sciences in his day. But he also wrote a major book in morality, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Most of what I talk about tonight will be about his first book, that book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So for him, certainly the two things went together. But more theoretically, what I'd say is, economics is about how we produce goods, how we maximize that production, sell, so forth, how we can increase the product for everyone. But there's a question about distribution, relationships between the poor and the rich, the degree to which the government might interfere in that process without interfering in our freedom. what is freedom anyway, and how does it play into the economic realm? All of those are moral philosophical questions. And it used to be in the work of certainly Adam Smith and, let's say, John Stuart Mill, that these things were closely intertwined. And they've come apart more, but I think that's actually a shame. I would like to see a greater integration between moral philosophy and economics in general. And Smith is a perfect figure to talk about in that context.
Definitely. Basing all that off of Adam Smith, I have a feeling it's going to be a really interesting take on it, especially based on the philosophy of your teachings. So since we're already on the subject of philosophy and politics, because I noticed you're a political philosophy teacher, can understanding one almost better understand the other, or vice versa?
Well, again, philosophy and politics intersect in some of the same basic questions, on some of the same basic questions that philosophy and economics intersect. What is freedom? What is a just distribution of goods? To what extent should government be involved in the economy, but also in our moral lives, in religion, in social lives, and so forth? Right. So there's certainly big philosophical questions that we bring to politics, and often those questions don't get examined very carefully. Now, ideally, philosophy will help us all question our ideologies deeply enough that we can realize we can't be so certain of them. There's something reasonable on the other side. So if you're, say, a hardline libertarian and I'm a socialist, maybe we can both be shaken up by a philosophy class to see that we have more in common than we thought, that we're not so certain about our views, that there's certain things wrong with them, and then we can maybe come to a meeting point. Certainly, in the world of philosophy, certainly in the West, has been tied to politics from the beginning. You know, the founder of our field in philosophy, in Western philosophy, is Plato, whose most famous book is a book on politics, The Republic. Aristotle wrote about politics. Thomas Aquinas wrote about politics. David Hume, Immanuel Kant. It's certainly been a major concern. On the other hand, how many philosophers have actually served in political life and done a good job? Not so many. I do think that the polarization that you see in the United States today could be somewhat lessened if more people took philosophy and thought more deeply about their views. So I do think in that sense, the method of doing philosophy could improve politics.
Have you had any challenges in terms of the students in your class breaking down that vast difference between political views in relation to philosophy?
Well, this very semester I'm teaching an upper-level political philosophy seminar on equality. I have a hard libertarian and 2 communist/anarchists, self-proclaimed. So we definitely have the extremes in class, and they both in class discussion and online, we have a discussion board online, express quite strongly their views.
Definitely.
But I'm hoping that the very fact that they're in a civil conversation together and that I don't take sides between either one, and all of those 3 students that I just mentioned, that's 3 out of maybe 13, have told me that they really like the class and seem really enthusiastic. So I'm hoping that having people who in political life would only scream at each other across rival demonstrations, having them in a conversation in which they can laugh together and share the same text and talk together, that itself will help things. Definitely. I don't know.
No, that sounds really interesting. I almost want courses like that being brought to Boise. I know we do have political courses, but just having, like you said, students or just people in general with completely vast different views sat in a room and actually having a logical discussion, I feel like that really helps our political spectrum. So actually it's interesting because I was watching an old Walter Cronkite broadcast the other day, and something of the sorts of media was discussed. And so it really got me thinking, you know, how different the political spectrum was in those days compared to today. Do you think media has a larger reach given its heightened influence?
I think what I'm about to say is nothing particularly new, but I think the main thing that's happened that media has fragmented. People often say this. When Walter Cronkite was broadcasting, there were 3 major stations and people were all watching one of those, and all 3 of them were much more similar. They tried to stay above the fray. people believed in impartiality. Walter Cronkite was known for being someone who you could look up to, whatever your political views were, and that was true about many of the others. And today, instead, people rejoice in how much they are partisans of one side or the other. I think that's a real problem. That exacerbates the polarization. Larger reach, I don't know. A lot of people were watching Walter Cronkite. And now those same people are online, and some of them are reading crazy people in blogs. And many of them are watching only those who agree with them. So in some ways, I would say we have a smaller reach. I would say the media that at one time really worked hard at investigative journalism and trying to stand a bit above the fray, that's occupying a smaller percentage of our media attention. And that seems a real problem.
I do agree with that. And the idea of echo chambers being such a large topic when in relation to media and how influenced we really are based on phones and tablets and just unlimited information out there for us to seek, and so that kind of breaks it apart a little bit, makes it a little bit more biased. Well, I think we're going to wrap up, but now before we do that, is there anything else you want to mention based on your work or your lecture tonight?
Well, I have to say the main thing that occurs to me, I think it's quite wonderful that here in Boise, you have people who are really willing to bring philosophy and economics together and to talk about these issues with people on the right and on the left. I'm more on the left. There are Adam Smith scholars on the right and on the left, and that's something that's often not known. I wish there were more of that. I think this is a great model for other parts of the country and other institutions to follow. So I appreciate being here for the series.
Oh, we're very glad that you joined us all the way out here in Boise from Illinois. Thank you again, Professor. But I think that about does it. Thanks for being here today, guys. That about does it for BSU. From all of us here at University Television Presents, I'm Doug Mason. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.